The Last Supper is the final meal that, in the Gospel accounts, Jesus shared with his apostles in Jerusalem before his crucifixion. The Last Supper is commemorated by Christians especially on Maundy Thursday. Moreover, the Last Supper provides the scriptural basis for the Eucharist, also known as Holy Communion, or the Lord's Supper. The first epistle to the Corinthians contains the earliest known mention of the Last Supper. The four canonical Gospels all state that the Last Supper took place towards the end of the week, after Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and that Jesus and his apostles shared a meal shortly before Jesus was crucified at the end of that week. During the meal, Jesus predicts his betrayal by one of the apostles present, and foretells that, before the next morning, Peter will deny knowing him. The three synoptic Gospels and the first epistle to the Corinthians include the account of the institution of the Eucharist, in which Jesus takes bread, breaks it and gives it to the apostles, saying, "This is my body which is given for you." The Gospel of John does not include this episode, but tells of Jesus washing the feet of the apostles, giving the new commandment, to love one another as I have loved you, and has a detailed farewell discourse by Jesus, calling the apostles who follow his teachings, friends and not servants, as he prepares them for his departure. Scholars have looked to the Last Supper as the source of early Christian Eucharist traditions. Others see the account of the Last Supper as derived from first-century Eucharistic practice as described by Paul in the mid-50s. The Last Supper served the dual purpose of venerating Passover, the escape of the Jews from slavery in Egypt, and the establishment of a new tradition, Christianity. Terminology. The term, Last Supper, does not appear in the New Testament, but traditionally many Christians refer to the New Testament accounts of the last meal Jesus shared with his apostles as the Last Supper. Most Protestants use the term Lord's Supper, stating that the term last suggests this was one of several meals and not the meal. The term Lord's Supper refers both to the biblical event and the act of Holy Communion and Eucharistic celebration within their liturgy. Evangelical Protestants also use the term Lord's Supper, but most do not use the terms Eucharist or the word Holy with the name Communion. The Eastern Orthodox use the term Mystical Supper, which refers both to the biblical event and the act of Eucharistic celebration within liturgy. Scriptural basis. The last meal that Jesus shared with his disciples is described in all four canonical Gospels. This meal later became known as the Last Supper. The Last Supper was likely a retelling of the events of the last meal of Jesus among the early Christian community, and became a ritual which recounted that meal. Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians, 11:23-26, which was likely written before the Gospels, includes a reference to the Last Supper but emphasizes the theological basis rather than giving a detailed description of the event or its background and setting the overall narrative that is shared in all Gospel accounts that leads to the Last Supper is that after the triumphal entry into Jerusalem early in the week, and encounters with various people and the Jewish elders, Jesus and his disciples share a meal towards the end of the week. After the meal, Jesus is betrayed, arrested, tried, and then crucified. Key events in the meal are the preparation of the disciples for the departure of Jesus, the predictions about the impending betrayal of Jesus, and the foretelling of the upcoming denial of Jesus by Apostle Peter. Prediction of Judas' betrayal in Matthew chapter 26 verses 24 to 25, Mark chapter 14 verses 18 to 21, Luke chapter 22 verses 21 to 23, and John chapter 13 verses 21 to 30. During the meal, Jesus predicted that one of his apostles would betray him. Jesus is described as reiterating, despite each apostle's assertion that he would not betray Jesus, that the betrayer would be one of those who were present, and saying that there would be woe to the man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born. Mark chapter 14 verses 20 to 21, in Matthew chapter 26 verses 23 to 25, and John chapter 13 verses 26 to 27. Judas is specifically identified as the traitor. In the Gospel of John, when asked about the traitor, Jesus states, "It is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." Then, dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. Institution of the Eucharist, which is recorded as celebrated by the early Christian community at Jerusalem and by St. Paul on his visit to Troas, is held to have been instituted by Christ. Acts chapter 20 verse 7. The institution of the Lord's Supper is recorded in the three synoptic Gospels and in Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians. The words of institution differ slightly in each account, reflecting a Marcane tradition and a Pauline tradition. In addition, Luke chapter 22 verse 19b-20 is a disputed text which does not appear in some of the early manuscripts of Luke. Some scholars, therefore, believe that it is an interpolation, while others have argued that it is original. A comparison of the accounts given in the Gospels and 1 Corinthians is shown in the table below, with texts from the ASV. The disputed text from Luke chapter 22 verse 19b-20 is in italics. Jesus' actions in sharing the bread and wine have been linked with Isaiah chapter 53 verse 12, which refers to a blood sacrifice act, as recounted in Exodus chapter 24 verse 8. Moses offered in order to seal a covenant with God. Scholars often interpret the description of Jesus' action as asking his disciples to consider themselves part of a sacrifice, where Jesus is the one due to physically undergo it. Although the Gospel of John does not include a description of the bread and wine ritual during the Last Supper, most scholars agree that John chapter 6 verses 58 to 59 has a Eucharistic nature and resonates with the words of institution used in the Synoptic Gospels and the Pauline writings on the Last Supper. Prediction of Peter's denial in Matthew chapter 26 verses 33 to 35, Mark chapter 14 verses 29 to 31, Luke chapter 22 verses 33 to 34, and John chapter 13 verses 36 to 38. Jesus predicts that Peter will deny knowledge of him, stating that Peter will disown him 3 times before the rooster crows the next morning. The 3 synoptic Gospels mention that after the arrest of Jesus, Peter denied knowing him 3 times, but after the 3rd denial, heard the rooster crow and recalled the prediction as Jesus turned to look at him. Peter then began to cry bitterly. Elements unique to the Gospel of John. In John, Jesus has his Last Supper and is executed not on the day Nisan 15 but on Nisan 14, when the Passover lambs were slaughtered. Presumably the author preferred this date because it associated Jesus as the Lamb of God with the sacrificial lambs of Passover. John chapter 13 includes the account of the washing the feet of the apostles by Jesus before the meal. In this episode, Apostle Peter objects and does not want to allow Jesus to wash his feet, but Jesus answers him, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." JN 13-8, after which Peter agrees. In the Gospel of John, after the departure of Judas from the Last Supper, Jesus tells his remaining 11 disciples, John chapter 13 verse 33, that he will be with them for only a short time, then gives them a new commandment, stating, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." In John chapter 13 verses 34 to 35. 2 similar statements also appear later in John chapter 15 verse 12. "My command is this, "Love each other as I have loved you," and John chapter 15 verse 17, "This is my command, love each other." At the Last Supper in the Gospel of John, Jesus gives an extended sermon to his disciples, John chapters 14 to 16. This discourse resembles farewell speeches called testaments, in which a father or religious leader, often on the deathbed, leaves instructions for his children or followers. This sermon is referred to as the farewell discourse of Jesus, and has historically been considered a source of Christian doctrine, particularly on the subject of Christology. John chapter 17 verses 1 to 26 is generally known as the farewell prayer or the high priestly prayer, given that it is an intercession for the coming church. The prayer begins with Jesus' a petition for his glorification by the Father, given that completion of his work, and continues to an intercession for the success of the works of his disciples and the community of his followers. Time and place. Date. Scholarly estimates for the date of the crucifixion generally fall in the range AD 30 to 36. Physicist Colin Humphreys rules out the year 36 on astronomical grounds. He presents other grounds for holding that the crucifixion of Jesus occurred in the afternoon of Friday, the 3rd of April 33, and says that this was 14 Nisan in the official Jewish calendar that year. The Gospels say that Jesus died on a Friday, and that his body was left in the tomb for the whole of the next day, which was a Shabbat, MK 1542, 16 to 1-2. The Synoptic Gospels present the Last Supper as a Passover meal, Matt 26 to 17, MK 14 to 1-2, LK 22 to 1-15, and they seem to suggest that it was held on the evening before the crucifixion. This would mean that the Passover feast began at sunset on what now would commonly be called Thursday evening and lasted until sunset on Friday. On the contrary, the Gospel of John presents the feast as beginning on the evening following the afternoon death of Jesus. This would mean that the Friday of the crucifixion was the day of preparation for the feast, not the feast itself. Various attempts to reconcile these two accounts have been made, some of which are indicated in the article on the Last Supper by Francis Merschmann in the 1912 Catholic Encyclopedia. In the 1950s, Annie Joubert argued that, while in the year of Jesus' death the official lunar calendar had Passover begin on a Friday evening, a 364-day year was also used, for instance by the Qumran community, and that Jesus celebrated the Passover on the date given in that calendar, which always had the feast began on Tuesday evening. More recently, Humphreys, who holds that the Palm Sunday entry of Jesus into Jerusalem occurred on Monday, not Sunday, argued that the Last Supper took place on the evening of Wednesday, the 1st of April 33. If the Last Supper was on Tuesday or Wednesday, this would allow more time than in the traditional view for interrogation of Jesus and his presentation to Pilate before he was crucified on Friday. Location. According to later tradition, the Last Supper took place in what is today called the Room of the Last Supper on Mount Zion, just outside the walls of the Old City of Jerusalem, and is traditionally known as the Upper Room. This is based on the account in the Synoptic Gospels that states that Jesus had instructed a pair of unnamed disciples to go to the city to meet a man carrying a jar of water, who would lead them to a house where they would find a large upper room furnished and ready. Mark chapter 14 verses 13 to 15. In this upper room they prepare the Passover. No more specific indication of the location is given in the New Testament, and the city referred to may be a suburb of Jerusalem, such as Bethany, rather than Jerusalem itself. The traditional location is in an area that, according to archaeology, had a large Essene community, a point made by scholars who suspect a link between Jesus and the group. St. Mark's Syrian Orthodox Church in Jerusalem is another possible site for the room in which the Last Supper was held, and contains a Christian stone inscription testifying to early reverence for that spot. Certainly the room they have is older than that of the current Coeneculum, and as the room is now underground, the relative altitude is correct lower than those of today. So any true building of that time would have even its upper story currently under the earth. They also have a revered icon of the Virgin Mary, reputedly painted from life by St. Luke. Bagel-Pixner claims the original site is located beneath the current structure of the cenacle on Mount Zion. Theology of the Last Supper. St. Thomas Aquinas viewed the Father, Christ, and the Holy Spirit as teachers and masters who provide lessons, at times by example. For Aquinas, the Last Supper and the cross form the summit of the teaching that wisdom flows from intrinsic grace, rather than external power. For Aquinas, at the Last Supper Christ taught by example, showing the value of humility and self-sacrifice, rather than by exhibiting external, miraculous powers. Aquinas stated that based on John chapter 15 verse 15, in which Jesus said, "No longer do I call you servants, but I have called you friends." Those who are followers of Christ and partake in the sacrament of the Eucharist become his friends, as those gathered at the table of the Last Supper. For Aquinas, at the Last Supper Christ made the promise to be present in the sacrament of the Eucharist, and to be with those who partake in it, as he was with his disciples at the Last Supper. John Calvin believed only in the two sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper. Thus, his analysis of the Gospel accounts of the Last Supper were an important part of his entire theology. Calvin related the synoptic Gospel accounts of the Last Supper with the Bread of Life discourse in John chapter 6 verse 35 that states, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never go hungry." Calvin also believed that the acts of Jesus at the Last Supper should be followed as an example, stating that just as Jesus gave thanks to the Father before breaking the bread, 1 Cor. 11:24, those who go to the Lord's table to receive the sacrament of the Eucharist must give thanks for the boundless love of God and celebrate the sacrament with both joy and thanksgiving. Remembrances. The institution of the Eucharist at the Last Supper is remembered by Roman Catholics as one of the luminous mysteries of the Rosary, the first station of the scriptural way of the cross, and by most Christians as the inauguration of the New Covenant, mentioned by the prophet Jeremiah, fulfilled at the Last Supper when Jesus took bread, and after blessing it broke it and gave it to them, and said, "Take, this is my body," and he took a cup, and when he had given thanks he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." Mk. 14:22-24, Mount. 26-26-28, LK. 22:19-20. Other Christian groups consider the bread and wine remembrance to be a change to the Passover ceremony, as Jesus Christ has become our Passover, sacrificed for us, 1 Cor. 5-7, and hold that partaking of the Passover communion is now the sign of the new covenant, when properly understood by the practicing believer. These meals evolved into more formal worship services and became codified as the Mass in the Catholic Church. The name Eucharist is from the Greek word epsilon chi alpha rho iota sigma tau iota alpha, which means thanksgiving. Early Christianity observed a ritual meal known as the agape feast. These love feasts were apparently a full meal, with each participant bringing food, and with the meal eaten in a common room. They were held on Sundays, which became known as the Lord's Day, to recall the resurrection, the appearance of Christ to the disciples on the road to Emmaus, the appearance to Thomas, and the Pentecost, which all took place on Sundays after the Passion. Passover parallels. Raymond Brown has argued that, during the Jewish Passover Seder, the first cup of wine is drunk before the eating of the bread. but here it occurs after. This may indicate that the event was not the first Passover Seder, and hence more in line with John's chronology, which places it on Nisan 14. Although the meal could easily have been altered during the Last Supper for symbolic or religious purposes. Among Christian denominations, the Eastern Orthodox Church holds that this Eucharistic meal was not the Passover Seder, but a separate meal. The Presbyterian Church documents also specifically reject the Seder argument and state that given that no Jewish Seder texts exist earlier than the 9th century, it is historically implausible to attempt a reconstruction of the Seder to create a parallel to the Last Supper, and that the Gospel accounts clearly indicate that the purpose of the Last Supper was not the annual repetition of the Exodus. The 5th chapter in Quran, Al-Ma'idah, contains a reference to a meal with a table sent down from God to Isa and the Apostles. However, there is nothing in Surah 5-113 to indicate that Jesus was celebrating that meal regarding his impending death, especially as the Quran insists that Jesus was never crucified to begin with. Thus, although Surah 5-113 refers to a meal, there is no indication that it is the Last Supper. However, some scholars believe that Jesus' manner of speech during which the table was sent down suggests that it was an affirmation of the apostles' resolves, and to strengthen their faiths as the impending trial was about to befall them. Historicity. Some scholars consider the Lord's Supper to have derived not from Jesus' Last Supper with the disciples but rather from the Gentile tradition of memorial dinners for the dead. In this view, the Last Supper is a tradition associated mainly with the Gentile churches that Paul established rather than with the earlier Jewish congregations. Luke is the only gospel in which Jesus tells his disciples to repeat the ritual of bread and wine. Bart D. Ehrman states that these particular lines do not appear in certain ancient manuscripts and might not be original to the text. However, many early church fathers have attested to the belief that at the Last Supper, Christ made the promise to be present in the sacrament of the Eucharist, with attestations dating back to the 1st century AD. The teaching was also affirmed by many councils throughout the Church's history.